Hi everybody, Mrs. Tourtelot here. So I have another book to share with you this week by the author and illustrator that you're going to meet, Lesa Cline-Ransome and James Ransome. So this is another non-fiction book. This is another biography. This one's a historical one. Now remember last week we shared a biography of Venus and Serena Williams, who are still alive. So this is about a man who lived a long time ago. His name was Frederick Douglass, and he was a slave who taught himself to read and then escaped. And it's written, you can, if I go up here, you can see there, it says Lesa Cline-Ransome and illustrated by James Ransome. So these are the people who are going to come visit us on Zoom in a few weeks. And this is a book they created together, and it's a slightly different illustration style. I don't know if you remember last week the book we looked at, the illustration was more collage. This looks like an oil painting on this cover. So this is about a book about a slave who taught himself to read. And I remember last month we read that book called The Oldest Student, about a woman who learned to read when she was 104. And remember why she never learned to read? Because she was born a slave, remember? And it was illegal for slaves to learn how to read. And we talked a little bit back then about why might have been some of the reasons why slaves were not allowed to read. So this book kind of gets more into that and talks about kind of the risk that some slaves took when they tried to learn to read, but also why they really took those risks. So here we go. This is called Words Set Me Free: The Story of Young Frederick Douglass. So think about that title while I read. Words Set Me Free. Think about what that title meant. And this is kind of a longer book, so I'm going to put my glasses on while I read to you. And here you go. So Lesa Cline-Ransome, James Ransome, they visited our school last year and they signed the book for us. See, they said, words will set you free. Lesa Cline-Ransome, James Ransome. And you can see that. I'll try and push into the front too, so you can see these beautiful oil paintings by James Ransome. So, and just a quick word about point of view. So the point of view in this book is from Frederick Douglass's point of view. So he was the boy who was born a slave and taught himself to read. So the story is told from his perspective. My mama was named Harriet Bailey. They say my master, Captain Aaron Anthony, was my daddy. After I was born, they sent me to my grandmama and my mama to a different plantation. But when she could, she'd walk the 12 miles in the middle of the night to come and see me. It must have been a long walk, because by the time she got there, she was too tired to talk. I remember she would just sit on the dirt floor near my pallet watching me. I never saw her face in the light of day. In the morning, she'd be gone. Sometimes I wondered if I had only dreamed she was by my side, her rough hands gently stroking my face. When I was still young, Cook told me my mama took sick. I never saw her again. I lived with my grandmama Betsy in her cabin until our master told me to bring me up to the big house on what we called Great House Farm. Grandmama went back to her cabin, but I stayed behind with the other slave children. I was just 6 years old. Much of my time was my own because I was not yet old enough to work the fields. We ate our 2 meals a day out of a trough, just like the animals in the barn. We were always hungry, so we shoved down our meals of cornmeal mush with shells and dirty hands. But even the animals got to rest in the heat of the afternoon sun, and the animals were never whipped bloody for being too tired or too sick or too slow. So there he is as a little boy, and he was a slave, so the slave children, they just had to eat out of a trough with their hands. So this is a true story. So the author and the illustrator, they did a lot of research before writing this book. So all of these pictures and these words are all based on the research they did about what life was actually like for slave children. When I was 8, my mistress told me I was leaving the plantation to go to another master her brother-in-law in Baltimore. Master rented me out to make extra money. I could not imagine a life beyond my plantation. From Cousin Tom, an older slave on the plantation who had once been to Baltimore, he told me of a city so big and pretty, it seemed like 1,000 great house farms. So he's 8, and he's being rented out from one person to another. Do we rent people? When you think of renting something out, you think of renting a car, right? Or maybe you rent a lawnmower, you rent a movie. You don't think of renting people, right? But this man who owned him rented this boy who he owned out to another man. And he's 8. He's being sent away. On a Saturday when we sailed down the Miles River with all I owned in the world, my first pair of scratchy breeches and a shift, I did not cry. I was ready to leave Maryland behind. We arrived at Smith's Wharf on Sunday morning. Old Tom never told me that Baltimore looked as if it floated on a sea of waves. You see how he's tied up there on the boat. At the Elysiana Street home of my new master, Hugh Old, his wife Sophia opened the door and greeted me. Mrs. was small, not much bigger than me, and she had the first friendly white face I had ever seen. It took us a while to get used to each other. She had never owned slaves before, and I had never been treated like a paid servant. I was glad no one ever told her that there is a big difference between a servant you pay and a slave you own. So he was sent to live with this white family who had had servants before, but not slaves. So this woman was used to treating people better. During the day, I ran errands for my master. In the evenings, Mrs. sat by the fire and read her Bible aloud. Her kind smile and voice warmed me as I entered the room. I do not know why, but I asked her to teach me how to read. On that night, she took me into her library, pulled out the first book she saw, and sat down next to her. We started with the letter A, and she continued from there. The letters felt strange on my lips. As I read, I remembered hearing about a boy back on the plantation who had his thumb chopped off when he was caught reading, and the letters I was reciting got caught in my throat. I remembered my old master's words when he gathered all us slaves together to announce anyone caught trying to read will be whipped, and my mouth was dry. Every day she gave me more letters to learn until I knew I had the whole alphabet and a few words memorized. She promised me that soon I would be able to read the Bible on my own. I wanted to read for myself where in the Bible it said one man should own another. But before that could happen, the master found out I was reading. I couldn't blame her. Mrs. was so proud she had taught me all of my letters in such a short time that she told her husband what we were doing. I thought he was going to whip me right there, but his words hurt more than any whipping could hurt. This is what his master told him. He should know nothing but to obey his master, to do as he is told to do, he shouted. And my mistress looked away ashamed. If you teach him how to read, there would be no keeping him. It would forever unfit him to be a slave. I may not have known how to read, but I knew that if learning made me no longer want to be a slave, then I would secure my freedom one letter at a time. So do you get what the man who owns him, he's saying you can't teach slaves to read, because if they learn to read, then they won't want to be slaves anymore. So that was one reason why they made it against the law for slaves to read, because they knew once slaves could read, they would start to dream bigger, right? And they would start to read things and understand that they wanted to be free. The mistress locked the door to the library and hid away the newspapers. She watched me all the time to make sure I was not putting together any more of those letters she had taught me. I knew she wished she could take it all back, but it was too late. With a brick and a lump of chalk was how I first practiced my letters. I scratched them all along the brick streets and wooden fences of Baltimore. P looked like a sail on one of the ships. L was a leg with a big foot. 2 sticks crossed in the middle. That made an X. You can see there on the fence, you see him scratching out the letters. Then you see there he put 2 sticks to make an X. There was plenty of food in Master Ord's house, food enough to share. I started bringing along some bread in case any of the white children in the neighborhood needed convincing. These white children didn't have much, so for a piece of bread, I would dare them to write letters better than me. What they wrote, I copied. I told them my name. "Let me see you try to spell it," I said. Fast as I could, I ran to complete all my errands for my missus. Then me and my new friends would get to work on my writing. Rolled in the seat of my breeches, that's pants, was where I kept my copybook. When I ran through the wharves and narrow streets of Baltimore, I was reading. The words the ship carpenters scribbled on timbers and masts, the names of shops and streets, headlines from the newspapers held in a newsboy's hand. I kept all those words in my head and I copied them into my book whenever I got a chance. As I ran, I could almost feel myself free, running to a home where no man called himself a master of another. Sometimes before I returned, I stood on the docks watching the ships, free to come and go as they pleased. When I was 12, with tips I saved from my errands, I bought my first newspaper and learned new words. Words like liberty, justice, and freedom. Words like abolition. Abolition was the words the newspapers used when they called for ending slavery. These were the words my masters would never want me to see. Now that I was reading about Black people in the North, Black people who were free from slavery, it was like somebody had lit a candle to my world. I saw freedom everywhere I looked, and the hope of it was what kept me alive. For 7 years, I worked for my master and his missus down at the shipyard, lifting and laboring, and back at their house, toting and hauling, always pretending to be something I was not, always pretending that I was happy to be a slave. When my old master, Captain Anthony, died, I had to return to his plantation to be divided up with the rest of his property, along with the sheep, the horses, and the pigs. So the original person who owned him died. You know how when you die, you leave your property in a will? So he was considered property, just like the farm animals. So we had to go back. Great House Farm was the same as when I'd left it. Hunger, weariness, and sadness seeped into the souls of every slave. But the boy who returned to his birthplace was not the same me who had left years earlier. That young boy was now a 15-year-old who was free on the inside, but not free on the outside. I like that line. So he'd learned to read, and he'd learned about words like freedom and abolition. So he felt free in here, but he wasn't free in his body. Though my copybooks and newspapers were long gone, words comforted me in the fields while I worked. I chopped cotton from sunup to sundown, and words lay down with me at night when my body ached with pain and hunger. I knew that the words would put an end to my suffering. I just wasn't sure when and how the words would save me. I was hired out to work for a man named Mr. William Freeland, and while he was kinder than most, he was still a man who believed it was his right to own another human being. After my return to Talbot County, I became friends with Henry, John, and Handy, and I often talked to them about my years in Baltimore. When I first told them that I'd learned to read, they stopped short and they looked around to see if anyone else was nearby. Then they asked me to teach them, and I did. That's how I knew I could trust them. Because you remember, what's the punishment for being caught learning to read? They could be whipped, right? Or that one boy had his thumb chopped off. From then on, I devoted my Sundays to teaching my fellow slaves how to read. At first, we had school among the trees, me scratching out letters and words in the dirt with a stick. John caught on fast, and he helped me teach the others. They never missed a Sunday. Sometimes they brought others, who then brought others. We had a school before long, but as far as the master knew, we were just having church. Sitting on rocks and stumps and tired from a week's work, we sang out the alphabet like we sang out spiritual songs. Those of us who could read from the Bible. We were doing God's work. So the only time slaves were allowed off, they were allowed Sundays, and they were allowed to gather for church, which was them sitting around singing and talking about God. So they pretended they were having church, but what they were really doing was teaching each other to read. During one of our services, I got the idea for how I could escape. Someone mentioned that they knew where the master kept his paper and quills, and did I think we could use them? At first I said no, we needed nothing from master, but then I started thinking. First I approached John, and then 3 others decided to join us in our escape. We would steal a boat from the neighboring Hamilton farm and make our way in the night on the Chesapeake Bay. From there, we would follow the North Star. There they are, practicing letters in the dirt. 8 years had passed since I sat in that library with Mrs. Auld learning my letters, and 8 years still since Master Auld had issued the warning to his wife. It was the only time in my life when I had agreed with my master. I was now unfit to be a slave. Just before Easter, with a fine quill, a quill's an old-fashioned pen, with a fine quill and paper secured by one of the house slaves, I wrote in a firm and steady hand. So this is what he thought is like a fake letter that he wrote. This is to certify that I, the undersigned, have given the bearer, my servant, Frederick Bailey, full liberty to go to Baltimore to spend the Easter holidays. Written with my own hand, 1835, William Hamilton. So because he could read and write, he was able to write this letter and pretend that this letter came from his master. So while he was escaping, if anyone stopped him, he would show this letter. And nobody would think that he faked it because everybody knew that slaves didn't read and write. I always knew that somehow words would set me free. But words on paper were now going to let me walk right out of Talbot County and into freedom up north. And there we go, that's a painting of him later in life. So Frederick did end up escaping. He made it up north, and usually, a lot of times when slaves would escape, they would pick a new name. So the new name he picked for himself was Frederick Douglass, and he ended up writing a book about his time as a slavery, and this book became a massive bestseller, and he kind of exposed a lot of what life was like of slavery, and he ended up becoming a really big part of the fight to end slavery because people knew by reading his book what life was like as a slave, and that helped a lot of people kind of come over to decide to end slavery once they knew what life was like. So there we go. Words set me free. What do you think of that title? How did words set him free? They did, right? In 2 different ways. Words set him free on the inside, right? Because they helped him realize what it felt like to be free. But then words actually literally set him free too, because he was able to write that letter. So I love all the different meanings in that title. So there we go. That is a book by Lesa Cline-Ransome and James Ransom. And you will get to ask them about this book when you meet them on Zoom. How cool is that? Anyway, I know this was a long book. Thank you for making it to the end. I hope you liked it.